Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, our mission is really to give you the essential synthesized understanding of the biggest global and U.S. developments from October 3rd through 5th, 2025. We're not just reading headlines here. We're trying to connect the dots on these really high-stakes friction points.
Absolutely. The sources we've reviewed, they paint this picture of, well, a simultaneous crisis, frankly. You've got deep political paralysis in the U.S., which is actively messing with economic mechanisms. And at the same time, global stability is kind of hanging by these very fragile threads. Think the Middle East nuclear arms talks. So the challenge today really is linking that chaos at home to all the uncertainty abroad.
Okay, let's try and examine that convergence. First, we really need to unpack let's say, the structural cost of this U.S. federal shutdown, like how it's actually interfering with managing the economy. Then we'll pivot to the Gaza ceasefire framework, which seems surprisingly conditional. And finally, there's this historic leadership change in Japan, quite focused on security. Lots to cover. #II fight, U.S. political gridlock, and the shutdown saga. All right, let's start stateside. The U.S. government, it's been officially shut down since October 1st. Congress just couldn't pass the fiscal 2026 funding bills.
Yeah, and it's important to stress, this wasn't just some technical glitch. This was the result of really bitter partisan fights. It wasn't just about how much money, but using these essential funding bills to force through some deeply controversial policy changes.
Right. So what were those specific policies causing the impasse?
Well, the big flashpoints, they included proposed cuts to Medicaid, big disagreements over healthcare tax credits, and also attempts to rescind certain foreign aid packages. These are politically charged social issues. They basically turned routine budgeting into this ideological battlefield with very little room for compromise.
And that stalemate just got worse between October 3rd and 5th, didn't it?
It did. Senate Democrats, they repeatedly shot down Republican short-term funding measures, stopgaps.
Which then pushed the White House on October 5th to issue that pretty dramatic warning about potential mass layoffs.
Trying to force someone's hand, presumably?
Exactly, trying to pressure Congress into action. And specifically, on October 3rd, the Senate rejected a stopgap that would have kept things running through November 21st.
Why reject even a temporary fix?
Because it was loaded with those same controversial healthcare provisions we mentioned. Lawmakers basically said, we can't even accept temporary relief if it means swallowing these policy pills. Okay, so the obvious impacts are furloughs, government services grinding to a halt. But what's the deeper cost you mentioned? Is it just economic pain or something more fundamental?
That's really the crucial point here. This government dysfunction, it's now actively interfering with the very mechanisms the world's largest economy uses to, make decisions. The shutdown means delays in key economic data releases. Think about those critical labor reports.
Oh, okay.
Which immediately clouds market visibility. It makes it much harder for the Federal Reserve to project things and set monetary policy. You can't really steer the ship if your radar's on the fritz.
Makes sense. And how's this playing out with the public?
Predictably, not well. By October 5th, voter sentiment was clearly eroding. The sources suggest that while, both parties took some heat, Republicans in the Trump administration seem to be absorbing more of the blame, especially among independents and swing voters.
So an inability to govern comes with a clear political price tag.
Definitely. #tag2. Clashes over federal authority and domestic enforcement.
And this dysfunction wasn't just confined to budgets, right? We saw similar friction bubbling up over federal power versus local governments, especially in these enforcement clashes.
That's right. The administration tried to assert federal authority in some Democrat-led cities, and it hit immediate legal roadblocks.
Like in Portland.
Exactly. Take Portland. A federal judge blocked the deployment of the Oregon National Guard. So what did the Pentagon do? On October 5th, they pivoted. They sent in about 200 federalized California National Guard members instead, tasked with protecting federal property.
Okay, federalized. That sounds legally significant.
It is, because that move instantly triggered legal scrutiny, specifically around the Posse Comitatus Act.
Right. For anyone maybe not familiar, that's the act generally barring the use of the U.S. military, and that includes federalized guard troops for domestic law enforcement. So deploying them like this immediately raises alarms about, military acting as police domestically.
Precisely. And Portland wasn't some isolated incident. On October 4th, the administration okayed sending hundreds of National Guard troops to Chicago. They were positioned near an ICE facility during a migrant crackdown.
And how did local officials react?
Sharp condemnation. Both Governor Pritzker and Mayor Johnson pushed back hard. It really underscored this widening gap between federal enforcement priorities and local resistance.
But amidst all this pushing of federal authority, we did see one instance of the administration pulling back, right? The counter-terror funding for New York.
Yeah, that was interesting. A rare retreat, you could call it. On October 4th, President Trump reversed a planned cut of about $187 million in counter-terror funds for New York City and state.
Why the reversal?
It came after some really intense criticism from local leaders, congressional figures too. It just highlights that, while the administration might challenge cities on enforcement or immigration,
Right.
cutting security funding for a major global target like New York, that seems to carry too high a political risk, even for them. #tag3. The complexities of the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Okay, let's shift focus now to global stability, specifically the Israel-Gaza conflict. There was talk of a diplomatic breakthrough, but you described it as incredibly fragile.
Yes, very fragile. It stems from that 20-point peace plan the Trump administration put forward in late September. Ceasefire, hostage returns, demilitarization, and this idea of transitional technocratic governance.
And Hamas responded.
They did, on October 3rd, with what you'd call a conditional acceptance. This is fascinating. They agreed to release hostages, okay? And they agreed to transfer administrative control to a new Palestinian technocratic body.
But there's always a but.
The big but. They explicitly declined to surrender their role as an armed force. So they're willing to shift the day-to-day bureaucracy, maybe, but not the actual military power structure.
Which sounds like a massive obstacle to any kind of lasting peace.
It absolutely is. Still, even that conditional yes led to some de-escalation on the ground. Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered a halt to the Gaza City offensive between October 4th and 5th. Forces moved into more defensive positions in some areas.
And the diplomats got moving.
Immediately. U.S. envoys, including Jared Kushner, headed straight to Cairo to start hammering out the technical details of a truce. And Qatar played a key role, helping coordinate with Hamas on their partial acceptance.
But this is all happening against a backdrop of immense human suffering in Gaza.
Exactly. The urgency for this peace push, however flawed, comes from that humanitarian crisis. Just before this pause, Israeli forces had really intensified their air and ground attacks. Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, reported losing staff members. UNICEF was highlighting just dire conditions in hospitals. And sources reported that Israeli attacks killed at least 22 Palestinians in just one day during that period before the pause. Just awful.
And that tragedy obviously fuels international reaction.
Hugely. On October 3rd, Italy saw a major general strike, mass protests in over 75 towns and cities, all linked to Gaza solidarity. This also came right after the interception of that global Sumud flotilla, where over 450 activists were detained trying to reach Gaza.
And that dissent wasn't just international, right? There were protests within the U.S. too.
Yes, significantly. On Yom Kippur, October 3rd, over 1,000 Jewish activists, including rabbis, held a really notable protest at Brooklyn Borough Hall. They were explicitly calling for an immediate ceasefire and a halt to U.S. arms shipments to Israel. It just shows how deep the moral and political divisions run on this, affecting public life everywhere. #TagTI. Global geopolitical and energy maneuvers.
Okay, so while the Middle East is grappling with this fragile truce and the U.S. is kind of paralyzed by the shutdown, there were some major shifts happening elsewhere, particularly in Asia.
That's right. Big news out of Japan on October 5th. The LDP, the long-ruling conservative party, elected Sana Takaichi as its new leader, which effectively positions her to become Japan's first-ever female prime minister. A truly historic moment.
Historic, definitely. But what does her leadership signal in terms of policy direction?
Well, looking at her initial cabinet picks, it signals a strong focus on continuity and particularly on security. She appointed Toshimitsu Motegi as foreign minister and Minoru Kihara as chief cabinet secretary, both seen as fairly conservative figures focused on national security.
Interesting timing, as China seems to be making its own diplomatic push in Europe.
Exactly. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is set to tour Italy and Switzerland starting October 7th. This follows Italian PM Meloni's recent trip to China. Beijing's aim seems to be reinforcing cooperation, especially in high-tech areas like smart transport, green industry.
But that likely raises concerns in Europe too, right? About dependency.
For sure. It's that constant balancing act for European nations, economic opportunity versus strategic dependency on Beijing.
Shifting gears to energy, what happened with OPEC plus spring?
They met and agreed on a pretty modest crude oil output increase for November, just 137,000 barrels per day. This really reflected some internal tension within the group. You have members wanting to keep supply tight to defend prices versus others, reportedly like Saudi Arabia, pushing for a bigger increase to maybe claw back some market share.
So a compromise that didn't drastically shake the market.
Pretty much. led to a modest price rise, but mostly highlighted that friction within OPEC Plus.
And finally, on the global stage, there was this development on nuclear arms control between the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah, quite notable given the current tensions over Ukraine. President Trump publicly backed a proposal from Putin. The idea is for both nations to voluntarily stick to the strategic nuclear deployment limits even after the New START treaty expires in 2026.
That sounds cooperative in the midst of everything else.
It does, but it also came right alongside Putin issuing a stark warning. He basically said that the U.S. supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine would seriously jeopardize relations further. So it's a complex signal. Cooperation on one hand, warning on the other, hashtag tag to V, economic signals and environmental risks.
Okay, let's wrap up by looking at some really deep contradictions, especially in the economic sphere. We've talked about the shutdown, global crises, yet the Dow Jones and S&P 500 closed at record highs on October 3rd. How does that even work?
Right. It seems totally counterintuitive. It really boils down to market optimism, kind of overriding the immediate political mess. Specifically, optimism about potential future interest rate cuts from the Federal Reserve. Sentiment won out over reality, at least temporarily.
But it wasn't all sunshine and roses in the markets.
No, definitely not. The Nasdaq lagged behind, and that was partly due to some specific tech sector weakness. Applied Materials, for instance, put out a warning about a potential $600 million hit to its 2026 revenue. So beneath the surface, there were signs of stress.
What felt particularly jarring was this confluence of environmental issues and policy moves, that Chevron refinery fire.
Yeah, the explosion and fire at the El Segundo refinery in California on October 2nd, a major incident. And the timing was just stark. It happened precisely as the Trump administration was actively trying to shut down the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, the CSB.
Just remind us, what does the CSB actually do?
It's the crucial independent federal agency. Their whole job is to investigate the root causes of industrial chemical accidents, like this refinery fire. They figure out what went wrong to prevent it from happening again, often leading to new safety regulations.
So a major fire happens just as the administration wants to dismantle the very agency meant to investigate and learn from such incidents.
Exactly. It throws that policy fight into really sharp relief.
And that wasn't the only policy clash on the environmental or energy front?
No. The administration also announced almost $8 billion in cuts to clean energy projects. And these cuts were specifically targeted across 16 states that had voted for Kamala Harris.
Wow.
Proponents framed it as cutting wasteful spending, naturally. But critics immediately slammed it as pretty blatant political retribution. Lawsuits are already expected.
We also saw environmental risks playing out dramatically elsewhere in the world.
Yes. That severe blizzard on the Tibet side of Mount Everest on October 5th. It stranded hundreds of trekkers. Rescue teams thankfully managed to guide about 350 people to safety, but the whole event just reignites these urgent discussions about the Himalayas, increasingly volatile weather, and frankly, mountaineering safety standards up there.
In rounding things out, there were crises in retail and public health too.
Yeah, a couple of significant ones. Rite Aid announced it was closing all its remaining U.S. stores, just couldn't handle the debt burden anymore. And that immediately sparked serious concerns about creating more pharmacy deserts, especially in underserved communities.
And in Brazil.
A really concerning public health crisis. A wave of methanol poisoning cases, over 120 reported illnesses linked to tainted alcohol. It triggered emergency recalls and, predictably, debates about gaps in product safety regulation there. Hashtag tag outro. So if you step back and look at the week, what we've really seen is this extraordinary test of, well, systemic resilience. You have domestic political paralysis in the U.S. It's not just political theater. It's actively interfering with basic economic mechanisms, eroding institutional trust. And at the same time, global stability is resting on these incredibly fragile diplomatic agreements, that conditional Gaza ceasefire, the tentative U.S.-Russia dialogue on nuclear limits. And all of this is constantly being tested by geopolitical rivalries, shifts in leadership like in Japan, and these calculated energy policy games.
Yeah, the sheer volume of concurrent high-stakes crises is kind of staggering when you list them out. You've got the shutdown delaying vital data, the refinery fire happening alongside attempts to dismantle safety oversight. Add to that a deadly earthquake in the Philippines that reportedly killed 69 people. It just highlights how fundamentally fragile things feel right now, how much our current operating environment depends on systems holding up under strain.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on. We've seen how the U.S. political gridlock is now delaying vital economic data the labor reports the Fed needs to make policy decisions. So what actually happens to global confidence when the world's largest economy is forced to navigate more by market sentiment, by gut feelings, rather than by reliable, real-time facts? Something to consider. We'll leave you with that. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.